When the going gets tough, the tough gets going. Now to keep going, or rather to keep going on, and to make sure the show happens no matter what, you need to have the latest intel and insight. And here in Bisnomics, in your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes, that's exactly what we aim to deliver to you. I'm Tharindu Amarasekara, and our focus today will be on the current status quo of the Sri Lankan economy. What has landed us in this mess? And it's not just me talking about this, the whole country is now aware that economic mismanagement is what has led us to where we are. But how do we come out of this mess? And what are the main lessons that we can learn from it and the errors we need to avoid in our future? To talk about this, we have a very special guest joining us. He is someone with a vast knowledge and experience with regard to the economy of Sri Lanka and the global economy as well, who is none other than Dr. W.A. Wijewardene, the former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Dr. Wijewardene, absolute pleasure to have you in Bisnomics, and welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
Doctor, I'm going to start off by asking probably a very important question. Might sound very simple on the surface of it, but I'm quite sure the answer is not that simple. What are the key wrong policy decisions taken by maybe the current government and some of the previous governments as well that has landed us in this current mess that we are in?
Well, Tharindu, the present economic crisis is not actually something which the present government has done. The roots of the crisis were shown even before that by the Mahinda Rajapaksa administration that came to power in 2005 and the Ranil Wickremesinghe administration that came to power in 2015. There had been some seeds that had been sown in the field of Sri Lanka's economy that had led to the present economic crisis that we are having. The main reason which Mahinda Rajapaksa administration did was that Mahinda Rajapaksa administration had a new economic policy strategy which depended on developing the domestic economy and through the domestic economy to create wealth for Sri Lankan people. And therefore, that administration ignored the importance of the international trade for creating wealth and prosperity for Sri Lankans. So as a result, in year 2005, when Mahinda Rajapaksa became the president, the exports accounted for 25% of the country's GDP. By year 2010, it fell to 15% of GDP, and by the time Mahinda Rajapaksa administration was voted out in 2015, it had fallen to 12%. Now, it was the responsibility of the Ranil Wickremesinghe administration to reverse this trend, but unfortunately, Ranil Wickremesinghe administration could not do that, and as a result, what happened was the deterioration of the country's external trade as the main source of country's prosperity and wealth started during that period also. And by the time this Gotabaya Rajapaksa administration came to power in 2019, Sri Lanka's export had just accounted for only 11% of the GDP of the country. What it means is, when the GDP had gone up by a certain percentage, the exports have not gone up by the same percentage. So that is why the share of exports in GDP had fallen. Then, of course, there are several policy errors made by the Gotabaya Rajapaksa administration. To begin with, they had the first policy error, where the government had offered a very lucrative and attractive tax concession to income taxpayers and also the value-added taxpayers, losing about, say, 600 billion annual income for the government. So when the income fell, and as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, when the expenditure went up, there was a huge gap in the budget. The budget gap was financed by printing money through the central bank and also allowing the government to borrow from the commercial banking sector, which ordinary people refer to as money printing. So as a result, there had been money, domestic liquidity had been in the hands of the people, which they used to import goods and services from the rest of the world. And as a result, What happened was that Gotabaya Rajapaksa administration had done a number of policy errors. The most prominent policy error was the offer of this very attractive tax concession to income tax and value taxpayers, losing about 600 billion Sri Lanka rupees annually by way of government revenue. As a result, the people had more, and the government had at the same time, the expenditure had gone up. So the budget deficit, which had been around, say, 6% of GDP, had gone up to, say, 12% of GDP. The huge budget gap had to be filled by borrowing from the banking sector. And as a result, people had more money in their hands than necessary. So they spent that money on the imported goods and services. So it affected the balance of payments of the country. We had the huge deficit in the balance of payment. And that deficit had caused the depletion of foreign reserves by the central bank. And at the same time, when the foreign reserves are depleted, what would happen is that the Sri Lanka rupee would come under pressure for depreciation, but the Gotabaya Rajapaksa administration had maintained it artificially around 200 rupees per US dollar. And it could not maintain this artificially because central bank did not have foreign reserves anymore. So finally, they had to give it up by, say, March 2022. Then the rupee fell to initially to 230, and now finally it has been settled around 360. But still, since the central bank does not have sufficient foreign exchange balance to meet the requirement of the market, this 360 level which the central bank is maintaining is also artificial. And we don't know when it would actually fall to a new high level. And when it happens, and there is no way for the central bank to control it. So we are actually the victims of a number of policy errors made by Gotabaya Rajapaksa administration. And those policy errors have been the main cause of the present crisis that we are having.
Dr. Wijewardene, with regard to this excessive money printing, I mean, today we are looking at one of the highest rates of inflation in the world, I believe, and we have been declared by so many foreign sources as being in the zone of hyperinflation, because I believe that in the month of June to July we have gone and crossed over into the 50% range. Now we saw a recent statement by the governor of the central bank that headline inflation might get somewhere close to about 70%. Weren't the authorities aware that this excessive money printing is going to lead to this kind of inflation, or did they simply choose to just ignore it?
Well, what happened, Tarindu, was that they not only ignored, they followed a new monetary theory known as this modern monetary theory, which is, shortened as MMT, which had been advocated by a breakaway group of mainstream economists, very few people, about a dozen of people, which had told these people that there is nothing wrong in the central bank printing money or the government printing money in order to finance the government budget. So as a result, they followed that particular MMT, both Governor W.D. Lakshman and also the Governor Ajitnath Cabral. They followed the MMT, and as a result, what happened was the central bank had allowed the money stock, the total broad money in the country, to go up by about 4.3 trillion Sri Lanka rupees during the 29th time period, beginning from end of December 2019 and ending in May 2022, and it was a 53% increase. So naturally, when the money supply goes up by that amount, the normal monetary theory being followed by the central bank, not only our central bank, all the central banks in the world would tell us that it would lead to very high inflation because the Sri Lanka's economic growth had been about, say, 1% during these 2 years. So therefore, the current 54% inflation rate recorded by Sri Lanka as at the end of June 2022 is not a surprise. But it is also not a surprise because even after the new governor came to power, there had been an increase in the total money stock of the country. And therefore, it should go up to 70%. And in my estimate, it will go up to even 100% in the next 2 to 3 months time period.
Understood, Dr. Wijewardene. Now, with regard to the main debt that we have as a country, now we see desperate measures being put in place to try and restructure the debt. I believe that it is being done as something like a throw of the last dice, but the common consensus is that this should have been done a few years before, when we saw COVID coming in, when we saw the tourism revenue drying up, that things should have been done back then. Do you believe that if we had made this attempt a few years before, that things would have been much more easier for us by now?
You are correct, Tarindu, because in the first quarter of year 2020, International Monetary Fund had released a report saying that Sri Lanka's foreign debt was not sustainable. What we mean by not sustainable is that if the country had to reborrow in order to repay the existing debt, also pay interest, and also if you lose this market access for whatever the reason, you cannot borrow it, and as a result, you cannot you have to use your foreign reserves to service this debt. So in the first quarter of 2020, the warning had been given by the International Monetary Fund, but that had been grossly ignored by the central bank management at that time, as well as the management that came to power after Governor Lakshman had left the central bank. So both Governor Lakshman and the Governor Ajit Cabral are responsible for making Sri Lanka's debt continuously unsustainable. But today we have another problem, Tarindu. That problem is the central bank had underreported the country's foreign debt. Since we don't have any foreign exchange in Sri Lanka, what would happen is that Sri Lanka will have to service all the debt, not only the debt contracted by the central government, the debt contracted by the private sector, debt contracted by government entities like, say, Ceylon Petroleum Corporation, Sri Lankan Airlines, Ceylon Electricity Board. Now, all these will have to be paid by Sri Lanka. Now, if we take the total debt stock as at the end of year 2021, taking into account the borrowings of the central government, borrowings of the government entities, and the borrowings of the private sector, it comes to about 69 billion US dollars, and we have to repay that, and we don't have any foreign exchange to repay it. So any debt restructuring that is needed right now will have to cover all the debt the country has contracted during this period. So it's a massive exercise, Tarindu, and that exercise cannot be done immediately, but it has to be done. And but of course, there are various spanners that have been placed before Sri Lanka when it tries to restructure its debt. One of the investors in international sovereign bonds of the bond that is to mature on 25th of July had taken Sri Lanka to Federal District Court in New York and pleaded for the court to direct the government of Sri Lanka to pay in full the principal amount which the particular investor had invested, 250 million US dollars, and the interest, due interest on that particular investment about 6 million US dollars. So altogether about 257 million US dollars. So if the judgment is delivered in favor of this particular investor, Sri Lanka government will have a great difficulty in going for this debt restructuring program, because there is a principle called equal treatment of all the lenders to government of Sri Lanka. So other lenders might say, if you have paid in full to this particular investor, you have to pay in full to us also.
Dr. Wijewardene, I believe you are sharing a lot of valuable thoughts and concerns with us, which I believe is what the people of this country need to be aware as well. And we are going to come back to you on more details after this short break. We will be back after this short break. This is Bisnomics. Welcome back to Bisnomics, your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. Our focus today is on the current status of the Sri Lankan economy, what led us to this mess, and what can get us out of it. And we are in conversation with the veteran economist, Dr. W.A. Wijewardene. Dr. Wijewardene, the amount of debt, we have $51 billion of debt. Now, clearly, if a country has borrowed so much, there has to be certain evident development, evident growth, evident investments. We do have a few towers here and there which hardly generate any economic value to this country. But apart from that, the rest of this money, has it been gobbled up by corruption, or was it used for the unsustainable consumption of the people of this country? What exactly happened to all these borrowings as per your expertise, sir?
Tarindu, I'll have to correct you that the total outstanding liability of Sri Lanka is not 51 billion US dollars as reported by the central bank, but 69 billion US dollars. That's a huge sum. And in fact, what would happen is that we'll have to restructure all this debt. If we don't do that, what would happen is we have no foreign exchange to repay them. We have to default all these, loans. So once we default these loans, we have a big problem of borrowing anymore. And to answer your question that how have we utilized these borrowings from the foreign sources is that they had been used in projects that would not generate any foreign exchange earnings for Sri Lanka. For example, now we have the tallest tower in Colombo called the Lotus Tower. That does not earn not only foreign exchange, but also even a single rupee it doesn't earn. So the taxpayers will have to pay the repayment of the total borrowing, and also the country will have to supply foreign exchange to repay that. So likewise, there are many white elephants. I can say they are all super white elephants that had been brought into Sri Lanka's economy by borrowing from abroad. And all these white elephants are now causing problems for Sri Lanka.
Dr. Wijewardene, in terms of the situation which we are in right now, is this a repeat of the 1970s or is it worse than that? And what kind of economic policies do you propose to get the country out of this mess?
Tarindu, I might say it is worse than 1970s because not only the economy, the entire system in Sri Lanka has now come to a standstill. The government services, education, healthcare services, the energy supply, the electricity production, all these systems in Sri Lanka have now come to a standstill. And as a result, we don't know, we cannot move either forward or we cannot move backward. So we are just like in this, Hollywood movies, you would have seen there are, whenever the globe is attacked by some alien virus, people die as they remain there. So likewise, Sri Lanka has also come to that particular status now. So as a result, we cannot move forward, nor can we move backward, and we have come to a standstill now.
Dr. Wijewardene, what kind of economic policies do you propose for Sri Lanka to take in order to come out of this mess? And are you happy seeing the policies which are being taken by the current central bank governor and his team?
Arindu, in fact, the policy measures taken by the current governor to come out of the macroeconomic crisis is perfectly correct. It's in the correct direction. But we have to understand the fact that what central bank can do is to create necessary financial conditions in Sri Lanka for people in Sri Lanka to work hard and create a real natural wealth for the country. That has to be done by the government. The central bank will simply enable us to create the necessary conditions for real economic activities to take place in the country, and that is what Governor Nandalal Singh has been doing right now. But the major responsibility of rescuing Sri Lanka from the current crisis rests on the government, and they have to come up with the program to create new wealth by way of creating new real sector economic activities. Agriculture, industry, and services have to be promoted by the current government, and as a result, we would be able to come up with the new. In fact, we will be able to get out of the present crisis. So, central bank's action to create macroeconomic stability is necessary, but not sufficient for Sri Lanka to come up with the required economic growth for the country. So, in my view, what would happen immediately, Tarindu, is that we all get, shrunk. We will have to give up most of the modern comforts that we are enjoying today. And finally, we'll all have to work hard. And that hard work has to be done by all the people, including President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, his cabinet of ministers, parliamentarians, all the people in the country will have to work hard and generate a new real wealth for the country. So that part has to be initiated by the government, and the central bank will simply create the necessary conditions conducive for the government to start this real sector development.
Understood, Dr. Wijewardene. In terms of the economic situation of the country, one of the most key highlights or one of the most look forward to updates was the comments from the IMF. Now, there's been a lot of talk about going to the IMF. Yes, I believe we have gone to the IMF close to about 15 times in the past as well. But we had a team from the IMF visiting, and they had given a comment saying that things are looking a little tight, especially because of the debt structure being quite unsustainable. Where to from now, Dr. Wijewardene? What are your thoughts on that visit and the main statements they made after that? And once again, the question that a lot of the common people in the country have is, where to from now?
Well, Tarindu, any bailout package offered by the IMF will help Sri Lanka to get a few, billions of dollars for us to, meet part of our requirements. If you look at the total requirements of the country during the next, say, 6 months time period, it comes to about 10 billion US dollars. And the IMF will give us at most 4 billion US dollars. The balance has to be funded by way of bridge finance coming from either India or China.
I believe recently, after many years of discussion, Zambia has got somewhere around $1.5 billion.
Yeah. In our case, Tarindu, we are in a position to get this extended fund facility from IMF, which will amount to about, say, 3.2 billion US dollars. And there is this rapid financing instrument, RFI, where we would be able to draw up to 100% of our quota in IMF, which comes to about 800 million US dollars. So altogether, the maximum amount we can expect from IMF is about 4 billion US dollars, which is not sufficient for us to resolve all our issues. So IMF will, again, as I have mentioned earlier, would be necessary, but not sufficient for Sri Lanka to come out of the financial crisis.
Dr. Wijewardene, in terms of the IMF comment on the debt being unsustainable, in the long run, what kind of repercussions are we seeing here? Will it become even more difficult to raise funds for Sri Lanka through international sovereign bonds? And I believe already our bonds have fallen into something like a junk status, and it's traded at extremely high discounts. What are your comments on this, sir?
You are perfectly correct, Tarindu. The international sovereign bond market is no longer available to Sri Lanka because nobody wants to invest in those bonds, because we have already defaulted, or we have got the investors to accept a lower amount of the money that they have lent us. So as a result, no sensible investor would put their money. In that case, all we have to do is we have to generate resources from the domestic economy. To generate resources, Tarindu, we'll have to, in fact, run a surplus in the current account of our balance of payments. In other words, we will have to get a bigger inflow of foreign exchange than the outflow of foreign exchange in the current account. For that purpose, we have to curtail our imports drastically, keeping only the minimum requirements of inputs and fuel and all that, and also cut down all other unnecessary payments. And at the same time, we'll have to increase, Tarindu, not only the export of merchandise goods, we'll have to increase the export of services as well. So by doing that, if we can generate a surplus in the current account, the balance of payment, we have enough foreign exchange generated within the country. For that purpose, we have to cut down our consumption, we have to save money, and we have to increase our savings from the current 20% of GDP to around, say, 30 to 40% of GDP. So what it means is all of us, including you and me, will have to tighten our belts. We cannot have the lifestyle that we are having right now. So be ready to visit the workplaces by either by walking or just by riding a bicycle, rather than using the fossil fuel to move to those places. So that has to be done not only by us, it has to be done by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, Prime Minister Wickremesinghe. They have to set an example by walking to their offices rather than getting their motorcades to take them to their offices. So this is the thing that we have to do in order to come out of the current economic crisis.
I believe, Doctor, even having a job in the first place might be a luxury as well in the times to come for some of us, isn't it?
Yes, of course, the unemployment rate is very high. Tarindu, now you may recall that when Nagasaki and Hiroshima were attacked by nuclear bombs during the Second World War, the whole Japanese economy got devastated. But the Japanese people, they changed their complete lifestyle, and they actually, some of the people worked without pay for several months, and they had only one meal a day. But what they did was, they had the brain, human brain, superior brain. They copied the technology that had been developed in the rest of the world, imitated that technology, and they produced an economy based on the high technology. Sri Lankans also will have to do the same thing. We'll have to make the supreme sacrifice, Tarindu, but at the same time, we have to use our brain power in order to take Sri Lanka back to where it was or where it is going in the future.
Stay tuned. We will be back after this short break. This is Bisnomics. Welcome back to Bisnomics, your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. I'm Tarandu Amarasekara. Our focus today is on the current economic status quo of the country, the wrong policies that led us to this problem, and the way out of this mess. And our special guest is the veteran economist, Dr. W.A. Wijewardene. Dr. Wijewardene, talking about some of the structural issues, you yourself mentioned this about the BOP. Now, we have been in a current account deficit where our outflows are more than our inflows for quite a long time period. Any proposed solutions or sectors that we should look at as an economy to come out of that?
Arindu, the merchandise exports on which we had depended in the past, like tea, rubber and coconut, and the apparel sector, they are no longer in a position to deliver high rate of growth for Sri Lanka. We have the human capital with us, and we have to use that human capital to build up a viable services sector in the country and export those services, sell those services to foreigners. So one area which we will have to concentrate right now is this ICT sector. Through that, we'll have to create an ICT market for Sri Lankan products, and that market will have to be actually developed by the government with its full support. So as a result, what would happen is that instead of depending on this merchandise goods for generating the required foreign exchange earnings for Sri Lanka, we'll have to come to develop the services sector. And one of the important areas where we can harness the service sector is the ICT, then education, healthcare, and finally tourism. So all these sectors will have to be developed simultaneously and generate a significantly high volume of foreign exchange for Sri Lanka, so that Sri Lanka would be able to generate a surplus in the current account on the balance of payments.
Dr. Wijewardene, do you think that our economic model is still too based on that the older models or the models of the 80s, and whereas when you compare with countries like Bangladesh, for example, and these were countries that US state officials had ridiculed and said it's going to be, it's a basket economy, or it's an economy that will never really develop. Today you can see how well developed Bangladesh is, and in terms of economic growth and prosperity, and they are targeting to be a developed country. They have a vision to be a developed country, whereas I have always heard as a school student that Sri Lanka is a developing country. I'm quite sure in your times too, these were the sentiments that were echoed. When you compare it with a country like Bangladesh, what lessons can we take in terms of adapting an economy to the modern world?
Harindu, as you have very correctly put it, Bangladesh was a basket case about, say, 20 years ago. But what Bangladesh did was they had done a massive amount of economic reforms. Now, for example, they have about 72 state sector universities, but they have private universities numbering about more than 150. So what they have done, Tarindu, is they have concentrated on the development of the human capital, ability of human beings to develop their brain, and through the brain power to bring new revenue measures for the country. Tarindu, I have visited Bangladesh about 3 years ago to find that the young people in very small rooms in Dhaka have been meant for producing 3D animation movies for Hollywood. So they use the small computers, and the software developed had been, of course, adapted from other countries to produce the 3D manufacturing movies, 3D animation movies, and they are selling it to the rest of the world. Now, if Bangladeshi youth can do that, there's no any reason why Sri Lankan youth cannot do it, Tariq. So that is why we'll have to look for where the market is, and then develop that market opportunity for Sri Lankan youth to produce these services for the rest of the world and earn enough foreign exchange. Now that is happening because Bangladesh had, as I told you, about 150 odd private universities. It had heavy, in fact, unlike in Sri Lanka, their university education is not free, they have to pay. But still, people pay money in order to get a university degree in science and technology, and they produce various services to the rest of the world. Same thing can happen in Sri Lanka. Now, for example, our problem is whenever the government is trying to introduce private university education in Sri Lanka, there are lots of people who are objecting to it. So as a result, we cannot move forward now unless we change our mindset to suit the modern world and also the world that is emerging in the future. We cannot do this, Tarik.
Dr. Wijewardene, now we see countries that have gone into similar problems, such as Zimbabwe. Now the recent news shows that Zimbabwe is actually going to start adopting gold coins as a way of payment because their currency has lost so much value. Do you see the same thing happening to the rupee as well? Let me also share with you something which you probably already know. Already there are some shops in Colombo which have priced certain items in dollars. So, do you see a similar problem springing up in Sri Lanka as well?
Arinu, that should naturally happen because when people have lost confidence in the rupees that have been produced by our own central bank of Sri Lanka, they will use a more effective and more efficient medium of exchange in order to do the transactions. Now, the example that you have quoted that Sri Lankan shops are trying to price their products in terms of US dollars is partial dollarization of the Sri Lankan economy. Now, I have been to Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, where this has happened unofficially, not with the support of the government, but unofficially, the entire economy has been dollarized. If you have US dollars or any other hard foreign currency, you can do any transaction in those countries. But if you have their own currency, you can't do it. Now, same thing can happen in Sri Lanka if the central bank does not take action to curtail the current rising inflation.
But with the inflation expected to hit 70% and then 100%, around when do you see, Dr. Wijewardene, that the inflation situation will reverse in some way in terms of to give some relief to the people? Because when inflation hits 70%, 100%, the question is, people, the ordinary people, even to get something like basic medicine, it will be such a struggle for them.
Harindu, this process of accelerating inflation will continue as long as the government wants the central bank to print money and fund the expenditure programs. So current Prime Minister and Finance Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe wants the central bank to print 1 trillion Sri Lanka rupees and give it to him to enable him to pay salaries to public servants. Of course, he cannot, default the payment to public servant, but he will have to get the central bank money. What I would suggest is that, it is actually Tarindu gross interference in the independence of the central bank. So if he wants the central bank to fund this money, my suggestion is he has to come to an agreement with the monetary board of the central bank that within a reasonable time frame, maybe 6 months' time, he will reverse this by repaying whatever the central bank had given to him, this 1 trillion US Sri Lanka rupees. If it doesn't happen, nobody can stop Sri Lanka's inflation rate moving above 100%. And if it moves above 100%, Tarindu, we are actually fast approaching the status of Zimbabwe and other high inflation countries in the world.
Dr. Wijewardene, is the large, or you'd say extra large public sector one of the key contributors to this economic mess that we are in? Because you and I both know that every time there is a new minister to some economic or other institution, they put their men, they put their people, the people who put up posters for them, the people who were close to them, and then, but when the ministers move out, these people don't really move out. This is a common practice that has been happening, and we all know, we hear the common sentiment, okay, we have to allocate jobs for this minister's people, that minister's people. So naturally the public sector has got bloated up over a very long time period. Is that one of the key contributors to the current massive public sector finance crisis we are facing?
Exactly, Tarindu, because the as you have very correctly mentioned, public sector has been used by politicians of all the political parties to provide cheap employment opportunities to their followers, their supporters. So as a result, when a new minister is sworn in, that minister would bring people who had supported him at the last election to the public sector, and the taxpayers will have to bear the total burden of paying their salaries. Even after the government has fallen and the new government has been sworn in, you can't fire these people and they will continue to be in the public sector, even though they do not have any worthwhile job description to be in the public sector in Sri Lanka. Good example I can quote you is that now our Sri Lankan railways is in fact suffering a massive loss right now. But during the British period, we had practically the same extent of the railway lines as we have today. In fact, we have a shorter amount of railway lines today, but the total number of employees during the British period to run that railway is about 2,000 people, whereas we have today more than 18,000. And as a result, the railway department cannot, pay the salaries, and the salaries are paid out of the monies that have been voted by the treasury. So this is what has actually happened. And if you look at the people, the profile of the people who are employed the rail department, you can always find, Tarindu, they have some connection, as you have said, to the former ministers of transport. So this has to be stopped. Without, stopping this, there is no way for Sri Lanka to do these reforms and shrink the government, downsize the government sector, and generate, depend the government sector operations through a small amount of taxpayers' money, so that the balance part of the taxpayers' money can be used for investment purposes. So we cannot do it now. We are actually maintaining a large number of public servants who are inefficient and also who are ineffective.
Dr. W. Wijewardene, was an absolute pleasure to welcome you and to host you in Bisnomics today. And I must add this, as of the day of this recording, the day we are recording this episode today, is actually your birthday. So I wish you a very happy birthday. May you have long years of good health ahead of you, and may you continue to share your knowledge with the youngsters and the professionals of this country and guide them in the right direction. And we sincerely hope that the authorities will listen to the wisdom that veterans such as you have to share. Thank you so much once again for joining us, and wish you a pleasant day ahead.
Thank you very much, Tarindu.
And with that, we wrap up today's episode of Bisnomics. With regard to the economic situation of this country, yes, so far it sounds all dull, doom and gloom. However, Sri Lankans have known to be resilient, and one sincerely hopes that with the right policy decisions being taken by the authorities such as the central bank, as well as the government and the relevant ministries, the resilience of the Sri Lankans will complement that, and we will be able to drive our economy towards greener pastures. I'm Tarindu Amarasekara, and no matter what business you may be in, have a profitable week ahead. I'll see you with the next episode. This is Bisnomics.